The winter of 1944 bites hard across the Lorraine region of northeastern France. The ground is iron frozen, the sky the colour of dirty pewter, and the wind cuts through wool and canvas as though they were paper. It is December, and the war in Europe has turned brutal in ways that even seasoned soldiers find difficult to comprehend. A column of men moves slowly along a rutted road, breath rising in pale clouds, boots crunching on a thin crust of snow. Among them, a young black American soldier, his name lost now to incomplete records, though his story is not, stumbles. His legs give way. He goes down hard onto the frozen earth at the roadside, and he does not get up. The men around him hesitate, not from cruelty but from exhaustion. Every man in that column is running on almost nothing. Rations have been thin, sleep has been thinner. The front is somewhere ahead of them, and nobody has time to stop. Nobody, that is, except the officer who happens to be passing. General George S. Patton, commander of the 3rd United States Army, the most aggressive and controversial fighting general in the Western theatre, is there. He sees the soldier go down. And what happens next is not recorded in the official dispatches, not celebrated in the newspapers back home, and not the sort of thing Patton himself ever mentioned in public. He stops. He crouches down. He gives the young man his own rations. Now you might be thinking that this is simply a story about one man's private decency. And in one sense, it is. But in a broader sense, it is something far more revealing. Because Patton, the general who was publicly reviled for slapping a shell-shocked soldier, the man who theatre command nearly sacked twice, the officer whose volcanic temper was both his greatest weapon and his most serious liability, was also a man of fierce, contradictory, moral convictions. And nowhere were those contradictions more vivid than in the way he treated the men who served under him, whatever their rank, whatever their colour, and whatever their history. To understand why that moment in the snow matters, you have to understand the America that produced both Patton and the soldier who collapsed before him. The United States Army in the Second World War was a segregated institution. This is not a footnote. It is a foundational fact that shaped everything from strategy to supply chains, from unit assignments to the quality of rations. Under the doctrine of the time, formalised in regulations that had been in place since the late 19th century and hardened by the politics of the Jim Crow era, black American soldiers were organised into separate units, often assigned to labour and support roles rather than combat commands, and routinely denied the promotions, equipment and recognition given to their white counterparts. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 92nd Infantry Division. These units existed not because the Army had embraced integration, but because political pressure and manpower necessity had forced Washington to find some use for the hundreds of thousands of black men who had volunteered or been conscripted to fight. Even then, many senior officers doubted their capability. Some refused to command them, others accepted the assignment but made no secret of their contempt. The result was a military in which a black soldier could fight in the same battle, on the same ground, in the same storm of shell and fire as a white soldier, and still be expected to eat separately, sleep separately, and accept without complaint a status that marked him as something less than equal. By December 1944, the manpower crisis caused by the German offensive in the Ardennes, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge, had forced some emergency desegregation at the squad level, but official army policy remained unchanged. Separation was the rule. Equality was the exception. Into this world Patton cuts an almost paradoxical figure. He was, by any measure, a man of his class and his era. Born in 1885, into a wealthy Californian family with deep Southern roots and a romantic attachment to the Confederate cause, Patton absorbed the racial attitudes of his upbringing as thoroughly as he absorbed the military history he devoured as a boy. He used language that would today be immediately disqualifying. He held views about race and hierarchy that were, in the context of modern understanding, indefensible. And yet, Patton also commanded the 761st Tank Battalion. He accepted them into his Third Army when other generals would not, stood before them on November 2nd, 1944, and told them, in terms that left no ambiguity, that he expected them to fight, that he believed they would fight, and that they would be judged by the same standard as every other unit under his command. "I don't care what colour you are," he said, or words substantially to that effect, "so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It was not an elegant speech. It was not a speech about equality in any philosophical sense. But it was, in the autumn of 1944, more than most generals were saying. The 761st went on to serve with distinction for 183 consecutive days of combat. They were in the vanguard of the drive across France and into Germany. They suffered over 700 casualties. They were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, though not until 1978, more than 30 years after the war ended. Patton never publicly advocated for their recognition, but he never failed to deploy them, and he never failed to expect of them exactly what he expected of everyone else. If you find this history worth knowing, and it is worth knowing, a subscription to this channel takes only a moment, and it makes an enormous difference to whether stories like this one reach the people who deserve to hear them. Now, back to the tent. Because the incident in the snow is only half the story, the other half involves a prisoner. By the late autumn of 1944, Third Army was processing significant numbers of German prisoners of war. Among them, on a date that the available records do not pin down with precision, was an SS officer. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, were not ordinary German soldiers. They were the ideological backbone of the Nazi regime, the men who had run the death camps, the mobile killing units, the execution squads that had moved through Eastern Europe leaving mass graves in their wake. An SS officer was, by definition, a man who had pledged personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler and to an ideology that classified human beings by race and consigned millions to industrialized murder. This particular officer, upon being taken prisoner, made a demand. He wanted a private cell, a room of his own, separate from the enlisted men. This was not, he apparently believed, an unreasonable request. He was an officer after all. Under the Geneva Conventions, officer prisoners were entitled to certain courtesies and separations from enlisted ranks. He framed his demand in terms of military protocol, of the proper treatment of captured officers, of his rights under international law. Patton heard the request, or, more likely, had it relayed to him through his staff. His response was characteristically direct. The SS officer was placed in a tent, not a private cell, not an officer's compound. A tent shared with the surviving enlisted men of the units he had formerly commanded. Specifically, and this is the detail that makes the decision something more than improvised contempt, with men whom he had personally ordered to be executed for minor infractions, or who had watched their comrades die by his direct command. The historical record here is, as with so much of this story, incomplete. Accounts of the incident survive in a handful of memoirs and second-hand testimonies, and the precise identities of the men involved are not fully documented. What is documented is the principle that Patton's response to the demand for privilege was to place the man demanding it in precisely the company he had considered beneath him, surrounded by the men his ideology had marked for disposal. It was a punishment that did not require a single blow to land with shattering force. Consider what the SS officer believed. He believed in a hierarchy so absolute, so biologically determined, that certain men existed on a different plane of humanity from others. He had built his identity, his authority, and presumably his sense of self-worth on that belief. He had acted on it with lethal consequences for those under his power. And now he was being told, not in words, but in the bluntest possible physical terms, that in this army, under this commander, the hierarchy he believed in did not exist. The men he had considered subhuman were his equals. In fact, given that he was now their prisoner, they were arguably his superiors. Patton never explained the decision in any surviving document. He was not a man who tended to explain himself, but the logic is not difficult to reconstruct. He had spent the better part of 1944 commanding an army that included men the United States itself had officially classified as second-class citizens. He had watched them fight. He had watched them die. He had watched the 761st go into battle with equipment that was not always as good as what the white units received, and perform with a ferocity and skill that silenced, if it did not entirely convert, even his most sceptical staff officers. He knew, whatever his private racial attitudes, what these men were capable of, and he knew what the SS officer was. The contrast was not lost on him. The impact of that decision, if it can be traced at all, is not measurable in the way that a tank battle or a flanking manoeuvre is measurable. It left no crater. It changed no front line. The war continued regardless. But the men in that tent knew what had happened. The SS officer knew what had happened. And the story, filtered through the memoirs and testimonies that eventually made their way into the historical record, tells us something about how power actually works, and about the relationship between authority and dignity. Patton's legacy is complicated enough to fill a library, and historians have spent the decades since his death in December 1945, killed not in battle, but in a road accident near Mannheim, just months after the German surrender, debating which version of the man is the true one. The general who slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a Sicilian field hospital in August 1943 and nearly ended his own career by doing it. The commander who drove his army harder than any other in the Western theatre, covering ground that his superiors considered impossible. The man who wept at the sight of the Ochterdruf concentration camp in April 1945 and immediately ordered the mayor of the local town to come and see what had been done in Germany's name. He is not a man who resolves into a simple figure. He resists the kind of clean moral framing that makes for comfortable history. But in the snow outside that field camp, crouching beside a young black soldier who had fallen from cold and hunger, he made a choice. Nobody ordered him to stop. Nobody was watching in any way that would have made it politically advantageous. He stopped because the man was down, and because in Patton's particular and idiosyncratic moral universe, a soldier who had gone down fighting deserved to be helped back up. And in that tent, wherever it stood, in whatever corner of liberated France or advancing Germany, he made another choice. He took a man who had built his entire identity on the idea that some human beings were inherently superior to others, and he placed him in a world where that idea had no currency whatsoever, where the men he had once had the power to kill were now, by every measure that mattered, free, and he was not. No lecture was required, no sermon, no tribunal. Just a tent, just the men, just the cold. The war ended in May 1945. The 761st came home. Most of the men who served in segregated units came home to a country that still would not give them the vote in large parts of its territory, that still expected them to sit at the back of the bus, that still measured their humanity against a standard it had never applied to itself. Patton did not come home. He died on December 21st, 1945, never having returned to the United States from the theatre where he had fought. But the story survives. The soldier in the snow, the officer in the tent, the general who, for all his contradictions and failures and prejudices, understood something fundamental about the nature of the war he was fighting. That it was, at its core, a war about what human beings were worth, and that the answer demonstrated not in speeches, but in the small, unremarkable, irreversible decisions of a frozen December morning, was the same for all of them, every one of them, without exception.